Imagine living in a neighborhood where the very people meant to protect you were the ones abusing their power. One of our HOA board members wasn't just another neighbor, he was a cop. That meant he could bend rules, cover his tracks, and silence anyone who stood against him. Fines, intimidation, favoritism, it all spiraled out of control. And when the truth finally came out in court, he walked away with nothing more than a fine and community service. But it wasn't over, because one of his victims couldn't take it anymore. And that tragedy lit the spark that would burn our entire HOA to the ground. When I first moved into that neighborhood, I thought I had found my dream home. The houses were lined neatly along tree-shaded streets, kids rode their bikes freely, and every lawn looked as if it had been clipped with a pair of scissors. It was the kind of place people dreamed of retiring in, the kind of neighborhood you saw in real estate commercials. At first glance, it seemed perfect to perfect, almost. And part of that perfection, I was told, came from the watchful eyes of our homeowners association. Now, I wasn't the type who loved HOA rules. Like most people, I found them annoying, at best, intrusive at worst. But the neighbors all swore by it. They said the HOA kept things in order, made sure the community stayed safe, and preserved the quality of life that had drawn people here in the first place. So I told myself maybe this was one of those rare neighborhoods where the HOA wasn't a nightmare but a blessing. For the first few months, everything really did feel that way. The board members were always visible, smiling at community cookouts, waving from their driveways, and reminding us how much they cared about keeping the neighborhood clean and fair. On the surface, they seemed like dedicated volunteers who had nothing but the best interests of the community at heart. But I started noticing little cracks in the mask. At first, it was small things you could brush off as misunderstandings. My neighbor across the street, a sweet older woman who had lived there for over 20 years, got fined for leaving her trash cans out an hour too long. She paid it quietly, but the frustration in her voice was clear when she told me. Another man down the block received a warning about his mailbox not being the approved shade of beige, even though it was nearly identical to the rest. These weren't isolated incidents. The board seemed eager to enforce rules on some residents while letting others slide. I tried not to think too much of it. After all, every HOA has its quirks, right? But as time passed, a pattern began to form. The people getting targeted were usually the ones who asked questions at meetings, who dared to disagree, who suggested maybe the board didn't always have the right answers. Meanwhile, others seemed untouchable. Their lawns could grow weeds, their cars could be parked crookedly, their Christmas lights could stay up until March yet. Not a single violation notice would touch their mailbox. And there was one man at the center of it all. He wasn't just another board member. He was a police officer. That gave him an aura of authority, a shield of credibility, and a sense of untouchable power that made him different from the rest. I'll never forget the first time I saw him at a meeting. He didn't just sit there quietly like the others. He commanded the room. His voice carried weight. His presence silenced complaints. People deferred to him automatically, not just because he was on the board, but because of the badge he wore outside of it. It wasn't long before I realized that his dual role as a cop and as an HOA board member gave him the kind of influence most people could only dream of. He had the authority of law behind him and the control of the HOA within the neighborhood. That combination was dangerous, even if no one wanted to admit it out loud. The red flags kept waving higher. Residents who crossed him seemed to suddenly find themselves drowning in fines and violation notices. Families whispered about run-ins with him that felt less like neighborly disputes and more like intimidation. I overheard one woman muttering that she was afraid to even attend meetings anymore because she didn't want to become a target. And yet, in the broader picture, the neighborhood still looked perfect. The lawn stayed green, the houses stayed tidy, and the HOA's monthly newsletter kept telling us how lucky we were to live in such a well-managed community. On the surface, it was a dream. But beneath that surface, something ugly was growing. A sense of fear, a sense of silence, a sense that one man's power was bigger than all of us. Looking back, now I realize those early warning signs were the start of something much darker. At the time, though, I didn't see how far it would go. None of us did. We thought the HOA was just strict. We thought the cop on the board was just taking his job seriously. We thought the system was annoying but ultimately harmless. We were wrong. The truth was that our neighborhood wasn't being protected. It was being controlled. And soon enough, that control would lead us down a path none of us were prepared for. It didn't take long before everyone in the neighborhood started to realize that our HOA board wasn't really a group of equals. Yes, they held their meetings and cast their votes, but there was one person who seemed to hold all the real power: the cop. His name was whispered at backyard barbecues, muttered in hushed tones after meetings, and avoided entirely when people saw him walking down the street. Bad. At first I thought people were exaggerating. Maybe they were just uncomfortable with authority. Maybe they didn't like having a police officer in their midst. But the more I saw with my own eyes, the more I realized that wasn't it. This man didn't just serve on the HOA, he used it as an extension of his badge. And because he was both a law enforcer and a rule enforcer, it made him untouchable. He had this way of turning every small disagreement into something bigger, something scarier. If you argued too much at a meeting, suddenly you'd find a violation. Notice on your door for something you didn't even know was against the rules. One neighbor of mine, let's call him Richard Wentz, raised a simple question about how HOA funds were being used. A week later, Richard got cited for having an unapproved garden ornament in his yard. The funny thing was, the ornament had been there for over a year, and no one had ever said a word about it. When Richard tried to contest it, the board sided with the cop. They always did. It didn't matter how logical your defense was. If he said, you were in the wrong, you were in the wrong. And if you pressed the issue too much, you'd suddenly see a police cruiser slowly driving past your house at night. Never stopping, never saying anything, just a reminder. A reminder that he had more reach than just the HOA. I can't even describe the psychological effect that had on people. These weren't hardened criminals or troublemakers. These were ordinary families, parents tucking their kids in at night, retirees tending to their gardens, people just trying to live in peace. But under his watch, peace was replaced with quiet compliance. The message was clear. Don't cross him, don't question him, and maybe, just maybe, you'll be left alone. The worst part was how smoothly he played both roles. At HOA events, he could smile and shake hands like the rest of them, joking with neighbors, and pretending to be just another friendly face. But when it came to enforcing rules, the mask slipped. He was cold, calculated, and completely without empathy. I once overheard a conversation between two board members after a meeting. They didn't see me standing near the doorway. One of them muttered, "We can't keep backing him like this. People are getting angry." The other responded quietly, "What choice do we have? He's a cop. He knows things about us too." That was when it really sank in. Even the other board members were afraid of him. This wasn't a man working with them. This was a man who had positioned himself above them. The HOA wasn't a collective. It was his weapon, and they were just the shield. The favoritism was the most obvious sign of his control. Certain residents, usually the ones who never questioned him, were given free passes. Their lawns could be patchy, their driveways stained with oil, their fences peeling with chipped paint, and no one dared send them a notice. But if you were on his bad side, it was relentless. Your grass could be half an inch too long, and you'd get fined. Your car could be parked an inch too close to the curb, and you'd get cited. It wasn't about maintaining the neighborhood anymore. It was about dominance. There was one particularly chilling incident that still sticks with me. A young couple had moved in and unknowingly parked their car in what the HOA considered a restricted area. Instead of just leaving a warning, the cop personally came to their door. Neighbors said he wasn't yelling, but his voice carried a sharp edge, the kind that left you rattled even if you weren't the one being spoken to. The next day, the couple received not one, not two, but 3 violation notices in their mailbox. Within 3 months, they had moved out. They didn't even bother selling the house at a profit. They just wanted to get away. Word spread quickly after that. People whispered that if he set his sights on you, your life in the neighborhood would become unbearable. And yet no one ever filed an official complaint. Why? Because he was a cop. Who would believe you? The board? They were under his thumb. The police department? He was the police. It was a loop with no exit, and he knew it. I started to notice how quiet the neighborhood had become. People still smiled, politely still waved when they passed each other, but there was a tension in the air that hadn't been there before. Conversations stopped when he walked by. Meetings became shorter, with fewer people daring to speak. The neighborhood, that had once seemed picture perfect, now felt like a stage with everyone carefully performing their roles, so they wouldn't draw the wrong kind of attention. We told ourselves it couldn't get worse. We told ourselves that eventually someone would step in, that his abuse of power couldn't last forever. But we were wrong, because soon something happened that shook everything to its core, a breaking point that showed us just how little power we really had. The neighborhood had been living under a quiet, suffocating tension for months. People whispered their frustrations behind closed doors, careful not to let the wrong words slip in the wrong company. We had all become actors in a strange play. Everything was fine on the outside, while privately nursing resentment, anger, and fear. But then came the moment that changed everything. It started like so many other conflicts with something small. One of the families in our neighborhood, a single mother and her teenage daughter, had been clashing with the HOA for weeks. The girl's car, an old beat-up sedan she drove to school and work, wasn't in perfect condition. It had a small dent, a cracked taillight, and the paint had seen better days. To most of us, it was nothing. Just a normal car for a kid just starting out in life. But to the HOA, and more specifically to the COP, it was unsightly and against community standards. The warnings piled up quickly. First, it was a notice taped to their door. Then a letter in the mail. Then a fine. The mother tried to explain at a meeting that she simply couldn't afford to replace the car right away, that her daughter worked hard, paid her own bills, and needed it. But her words fell on deaf ears. Or rather, they fell on his ears. And once he had decided they were in the wrong, there was no way out. Neighbors later said they saw him pacing outside their home one evening, inspecting the car like it was a crime scene. The next day, the girl's vehicle was towed. She came home from school to find it gone, impounded at her expense, with more fines stacked against her mother. That was the moment when things snapped. The mother confronted him in public on the sidewalk, in front of half a dozen witnesses. She yelled, she cried, she begged him to show compassion. But compassion wasn't in his vocabulary. The argument escalated, voices rising until someone called the police. When the squad car showed up, we all thought, maybe just maybe there would be accountability. But when the officers stepped out and saw who was involved, the entire situation shifted. They weren't there to investigate. They were there to protect him. Witnesses tried to speak up, but they were silenced. The officers took statements that painted him as the victim, the reasonable man just doing his job, while the mother was portrayed as emotional and uncooperative. It was surreal watching the system fold in on itself to shield one of its own. Eventually, charges were filed, but not against him, against her, for disorderly conduct. She was forced to hire a lawyer, drained her savings, and fought to clear her name. Meanwhile, rumors swirled that there were other incidents, other victims that hadn't even come to light yet. But fear kept people quiet. Then, almost unbelievably, the tables briefly turned. One brave neighbor finally gathered the courage to go public. She filed a formal complaint, collected testimonies, and pushed the issue until it couldn't be ignored. For the first time, the cop was the one facing charges. For a moment, the neighborhood held its breath, wondering if this was the beginning of justice. The trial was small but explosive. The courtroom was filled with familiar faces, neighbors who had suffered, board members who looked uncomfortable, and a handful of us who just wanted to see the truth come out. Testimonies were given. Stories were told. The victims painted a picture of a man who had used his dual power as both officer and board member to intimidate, harass, and punish anyone who defied him. And yet it didn't matter. When it came time for the verdict, his badge and his board shielded him once again. Members of the HOA board testified on his behalf, painting him as a dedicated community servant who was simply misunderstood. Fellow officers backed him up, vouching for his character, dismissing the victims as disgruntled or mistaken. The weight of authority was too much to overcome. The final ruling was a slap in the face to every resident who had hoped for change. He was let off with community service and a $10,000 fine. No jail time, no real accountability, just a token punishment that he could easily brush aside. I'll never forget the silence in that courtroom when the sentence was read. Some people gasped, others just sat in stunned disbelief. But the worst part was looking at the victims, people who had bared their pain, who had relived their humiliation in hopes of justice, only to see their courage dismissed with a fine and a shrug. When we walked out of that courthouse, the air felt heavier than it had ever been. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about what his acquittal represented. It meant the system had failed us. It meant that no matter how brave we were, no matter how much evidence we had, the truth didn't matter if the person on trial wore a badge and held a gavel over our community. That was the breaking point. For some, it was the moment they gave up. For others, it was the moment they quietly began planning their exit, putting houses up for sale, packing their bags, and getting out while they could. But for at least one person, it was too much to bear. And that was when the tragedy struck. The aftermath of the trial was worse than anyone could have imagined. Walking through the neighborhood, you could feel the tension like a physical weight pressing down on every lawn, every street, every house. People avoided eye contact, conversations were quick and cautious, and smiles had become mechanical. But beneath the fear, a storm was brewing, an anger that would not be silenced. Among the victims, there was one who suffered more than anyone else could see. She was quiet, soft-spoken, and had always been diligent about following the rules. She wasn't confrontational. She didn't complain at meetings. She simply tried to live her life, pay her fines, and obey the HOA regulations to the letter. Yet somehow she became a target. The cop on the board seemed to take a particular interest in her. Minor violations, her mailbox, her lawn, even the angle at which she parked her car were blown into official citations. Friends watched helplessly as her confidence eroded week by week. Each letter, each fine, each warning chipped away at her sense of safety. Her home, which had once been her sanctuary, began to feel like a cage. At first, she tried to fight back. She documented everything, kept a meticulous record of each notice and fine, collected emails, and even sought legal counsel. She attended meetings, spoke politely, and tried to reason with the board. But every effort was met with indifference, dismissiveness, or retaliation. The cop would subtly humiliate her during meetings, questioning her credibility or her intentions, and the board his. Fellow members backed him without hesitation. As months passed, the harassment intensified. It wasn't just about rules anymore, it had become personal. The emotional toll was immense. Her friends tried to intervene, offering support, advice, and ways to escalate the situation legally, but the weight of the constant intimidation began to crush her. Some residents noticed subtle signs of despair, missed social events, withdrawn behavior, phone calls she would take in private, and nights spent awake worrying about what the next day would bring. Then came the day that would shatter the neighborhood. One morning, her life came to a tragic and irreversible end. She couldn't endure the pressure any longer. Her death was sudden, heartbreaking, and devastating, not just for her family and close friends, But for every single resident who had silently endured the cops' reign of fear, the news spread like wildfire. Shock gave way to grief, grief to anger. It was impossible to ignore anymore. No longer could anyone pretend that the situation was simply about petty fines or keeping the neighborhood tidy. A life had been lost because of this abuse of power. That tragedy became the catalyst for change. For the first time, the residents spoke openly. Conversations that had been whispered behind closed doors were now voiced in meetings, in emails, and in neighborhood gatherings. People shared their experiences, corroborated one another's stories, and collectively realized the scale of the corruption. The cop wasn't just enforcing rules, he was terrorizing those who dared to question him, hiding behind the shield of authority and protected by an HOA that should have been accountable. The neighborhood that had been fractured by fear began to unite. Parents discussed strategies to protect their children. Seniors exchanged legal contacts and advice. Families who had considered moving out stayed to stand together. The tragedy had awakened something in the community, a shared purpose that was stronger than the fear that had kept them silent for so long. Pressure mounted. Complaints were filed en masse. News outlets picked up the story, exposing the HOA's misconduct and the cops' abuse of authority. Legal experts weighed in. Residents organized meetings not just to discuss grievances but to plan decisive action. The unity that had seemed impossible before was now a force that the board and the cop could no longer ignore. For the first time, there was a sense of momentum, of hope, even amid the grief. The tragedy had shown the neighborhood the consequences of silence and inaction. It had revealed the dangers of unchecked power, and it had lit a spark that would ultimately lead to the dismantling of the HOA itself. But the path forward wasn't simple or painless. While the community had found its collective voice, the battle against the cop and the complicit board members was far from over. Legal hurdles, intimidation tactics, and lingering fear threatened to derail their efforts. Yet the memory of the victim, the life that had been lost, kept everyone moving forward. By the end of that painful year, it became clear the neighborhood would no longer be a place where fear dictated behavior. The tragedy had changed everything. It had shattered complacency, revealed the truth, and united the residents in a way that no fine, no rule, and no badge ever could. And so what began as quiet oppression, endured in secret by countless residents, transformed into a powerful collective movement, a movement that would finally take on the HOA, confront the abuse, and demand justice for those who had suffered in silence for far too long. The momentum didn't slow. After the tragedy, the neighborhood had transformed from a community living under fear into a collective force determined to reclaim its streets, homes, and lives. What had once been whispered conversations now became open meetings, organized campaigns, and formal legal action. The residents, fueled by grief, anger, and a sense of justice, had decided that they would no longer tolerate corruption, intimidation, or abuse of power. It started with documentation. Every violation notice, every fine, every interaction with the cop on the board was carefully recorded. People dug through old HOA newsletters, meeting minutes, and emails. They collected testimonies from neighbors who had previously been too afraid to speak. The evidence piled up, revealing a chilling pattern: favoritism, intimidation, misuse of authority, and outright harassment, all perpetrated by the very people entrusted with maintaining the community. The legal battle was complex. The HOA had lawyers, and the cop had his badge, shielding him in subtle, systemic ways. Yet the unity of the residents proved stronger than the board's tactics. They reached out to local news journalists, picked up the story, and public outrage began to grow. Soon the pressure wasn't just legal, it was social, moral, and political. Residents attended city council meetings, petitioned for oversight, and refused to back down. Meetings that had once been controlled and manipulated by the cop and his allies became tense and unpredictable. Residents spoke openly about their fears, their pain, and their demands. Board members who had once testified on his behalf now found themselves on the defensive. They tried to justify their actions, but the weight of evidence and the intensity of the community's resolve was too much. Every attempt at denial or deflection only strengthened the residents. Resolved at the turning point came when a legal injunction was filed, forcing the HOA to open its records to an independent audit. For the first time, outsiders could see what had been happening behind the closed doors. The audit revealed the full extent of mismanagement and abuse. Fines issued without basis, violations selectively enforced, and instances where the board's actions had directly contributed to emotional distress. In harm, the cop's dual role as enforcer and board member was highlighted as a conflict of interest that had facilitated his abuse. Faced with mounting legal, social, and media pressure, the HOA could no longer function as it had. One by one, board members resigned, trying to distance themselves from the scandal. Meetings were canceled, newsletters ceased, and the once dominant organization began to crumble under the weight of its exposed corruption. Residents working together voted to disband the HOA entirely, a move that symbolized not just the end of an abusive organization, but the reclaiming of their neighborhood and their sense of agency. The aftermath was both emotional and transformative. Streets that had been silent with fear became lively again. Neighbors who had once avoided each other now gathered to discuss community plans, support one another, and ensure that such abuse could never take root again. The cop, stripped of his influence over the HOA, was forced to face the consequences of his actions in ways the neighborhood could now witness and respond to. While legal systems can be slow, the power of a united community had finally brought the issue into the open, making it impossible for him to continue his reign unchecked. Reflecting back, it's clear that this victory came at a heavy cost. A life had been lost, trust had been broken, and the scars of fear lingered in many homes. But the story also serves as a testament to the resilience of ordinary people facing extraordinary abuse of power. It shows how fear can paralyze, but grief and outrage can mobilize. How silence can protect perpetrators, but collective action can dismantle even the most entrenched systems of control. The neighborhood had learned a painful but vital lesson. Power unchecked is dangerous. Authority without accountability is destructive. And sometimes it takes a tragedy to awaken a community to its own strength. By disbanding the HOA, the residents not only reclaimed their streets, they reclaimed their voices, their dignity, and their sense of safety. And though the wounds of the past could never be fully erased, the neighborhood emerged stronger, more vigilant, and more united than ever. It was a hard-earned victory, but it was one that proved the true power of community, courage, and relentless pursuit of justice.